This is a comparison of the iPhone 14 Pro cameras and the Galaxy S23 Ultra cameras. We're going to get started with photo and then we go into video. And talking about video, we're actually filming in ProRes right now on the iPhone 14 Pro and a high bitrate mode on the Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra. So let me know what you think that looks like down below in the comments. Okay, so starting off with normal images from the main camera, and by default both of these cameras downscale to 12 megapixels. The iPhone 14 Pro is doing that from 48 megapixels and the S23 Ultra is doing that from 200 megapixels. Despite starting off with 4 times the megapixels though, I don't think the detail is that much more impressive on the S23 Ultra. I think detail throughout these photos is pretty similar. The main difference in the regular photos comes down to colours. Samsung tends to saturate more and go for those more vibrant colours, whereas the iPhone tends to keep things more realistic, if anything a little bit on the cool side. In terms of dynamic range, I think these two cameras trade blows depending on the situation, to be honest. Samsung can sometimes overdo the HDR, whereas the iPhone doesn't tend to raise the shadows too much and keeps things a bit more realistic. So it goes without saying that Samsung actually pays a lot more attention to zoom on its cameras than Apple does. On the S23 Ultra, we've got a 3x zoom and a 10x zoom with the capabilities of getting up to 100x zoom. Whereas on the iPhone 14 Pro, we've only got a 3x zoom camera. So this next example shows you just how much these cameras blow the iPhone away in terms of zoom capabilities. So first, here's a reference picture of where I was standing on this beach, and then we go over to an ultra wide shot, which is again a lot brighter, a lot more saturated on the Samsung image. At 1x zoom, again generally the sharpness and the detail is pretty similar. At 3x zoom, the Samsung might be pulling ahead a little bit with how good that zoom is and how good the detail is in this image. Now at 10x, the S23 Ultra does have a dedicated 10x camera, so this is obviously going to look a lot better. You can already see the detail is there, the sharpness is there, and it's a much better image than the iPhone's producing at 10x zoom. And then the next step on the S23 Ultra is 30x zoom, whereas the iPhone 14 Pro can only go up to 15x in digital zoom. It's quite clear by now that even the S23 Ultra's 30x zoom is better than the iPhone 14 Pro's 15x. And now we move over to S23 Ultra's 100x zoom, which definitely isn't as usable as the 30x zoom, but it's quite impressive that a camera on a phone can do this. I'd use this pretty much only for reference and probably wouldn't post any photos like this, but it's there if you need it. And the same goes here for the photos of these swans. The S23 Ultra performing really well. About 100x zoom, it just sort of blends in all the colours of the water and it makes it look a bit like an abstract painting. So next we're going to get into the portrait mode, but first, before we do, you are not subscribed, so if you want to see more videos like this on Tech for Creatives, hit that subscribe button and obviously leave a like for the algorithm, it really helps. Over to portrait mode now, and these phones are becoming so good with their cutouts, with both the iPhone and the S23 Ultra performing really well. Interestingly, in portrait mode, the S23 Ultra doesn't go as hard in saturating those colours or warming the skin tones, but the look is still really nice on both cameras. I think the S23 Ultra in most situations just about takes the edge with the cutouts. It seems to handle little bits of hair really well and certain gaps between the arms. I also much prefer the fall off of the focus on the S23 Ultra, but it's important to note that on both of these phones you can change the amount of blur afterwards. With portrait mode on objects, the S23 Ultra kind of had to be closer in order to activate that portrait mode, whereas the iPhone managed to do it from a little bit further away, although this wasn't consistent in my tests. When you compare them side by side with the close-up photo, again the cutouts on both of these are really good, but in my opinion the iPhone has a bit more of a natural camera blur in the background. It actually looks like a real bokeh from a camera, whereas Samsung just looks like a traditional blur. Both phones do have some inconsistencies with portrait mode and they do definitely trade blows. For example, sometimes the iPhone will definitely go too hard on the blur, but again you can change that afterwards. Sometimes the Samsung will completely miss the focus altogether. So in my opinion, where these phones really shine in terms of photography is their high resolution modes. So everything you've seen so far has been scaled down to 12 megapixel on both of these phones, but Samsung actually has the capability of shooting in 50 megapixel and 200 megapixel, and the iPhone 14 Pro has the capability of shooting in Pro RAW. In my opinion, the S23 Ultra does much better in 50 megapixel mode than it does in 12 megapixel mode. There seems to be less sharpening and processing going on, there's still a lot of detail there. And it's a similar story on the iPhone as well with Pro RAW, as again it just reduces some of that sharpening and makes the photo look a bit more natural. Switching over to 200 megapixels though, and interestingly, sometimes Samsung will completely fail to process the image and it just doesn't look as good as the 50 or the 12 megapixel image. So from now on in photos we're going to be looking at 50 megapixel on the Samsung, which I believe is the good middle ground, and Apple Pro RAW.
With the S23 Ultra's 50 megapixel images, you're definitely getting more detail out of the image than on the iPhone, but you really have to pixel peep, and I don't think it'll make that much difference in real life. In terms of selfies, again the S23 Ultra does come out warmer, and this is with the warm mode turned off as well, which is a little prompt that comes up when you go into selfie mode. Whereas the iPhone kind of goes for a more stripped back, cooler look. I definitely prefer the look on the S23 Ultra. In my opinion, that's the photo I'd be posting every day. Moving over to video now, and that's where the iPhone always shines, and it's no different here, but Samsung has caught up in a lot of ways. In difficult situations like this, the Samsung has definitely tried to bring up the shadows a little bit much, and it's made for a less realistic, less pleasing image. However, I'd argue that the stabilisation, at least in this mode, has almost caught up with the iPhone 14 Pro. Even video from the 3x camera, as you can see here, is much more detailed on the iPhone 14 Pro, despite me thinking that for photos the 3x camera on the Samsung was a little bit better. You can also see the dynamic range is slightly better on the iPhone too. Moving over to portrait mode video, or cinematic mode as it's called on the iPhone, and I honestly didn't expect Samsung to do this well. The iPhone still pulls ahead in a lot of ways in my opinion. It handles the hair a lot better and is more consistent with the focus, but the Samsung does a really good job at the cutout. The only thing I would say is that out of the box, Samsung really exaggerates that blur, and after recording you can't actually change the blur after the fact, whereas on the iPhone you can actually change the aperture and the blur after you've recorded. This meant that unfortunately I was stuck with this really unrealistic looking blur in the image, but I know now going forward that I can just change it before recording. Sticking to the theme of these two trading blows though, and in this video of the Swan, you'll see the Samsung handles the cutout a lot better. But again, I do think the bokeh or out of focus areas on the iPhone 14 Pro are a little bit more realistic. It just looks a lot more like real camera bokeh than just a blur effect. And finally, in portrait mode video, the stabilisation in my opinion is still much better on the iPhone. Now I'm not going to talk too much about the 8K video in the S23 Ultra, but it does capture a bit more detail in the image, which means there's less sharpening to be done in post. But honestly, the iPhone 14 Pro does such a good job in 4K with its great dynamic range and really nice detail that I don't think that 8K is needed on the S23 Ultra. And again in video, the zoom on the S23 Ultra is just superior. You can get into, I think it's 30 times zoom, and the image still looks really good. In sort of medium low light scenarios you can't complain about either. They each handle their own colours in a different way, but I think they're both pleasing to the eye. I think Samsung's trying to raise the shadows a little bit, whereas iPhone's trying to keep it as natural as possible, which has been a theme throughout this whole video. In macro mode, I think this is going to be personal preference to be honest, but on the main camera on the iPhone 14 Pro doesn't really have a macro capability. It'll automatically switch over to the wide angle camera. The wide angle camera on the iPhone 14 Pro is just noticeably worse, and so macro photos don't end up being that pleasing in my opinion. But the S23 Ultra, you can actually focus quite close up with the main camera and you end up getting really nice natural depth of field. This is true with video as well, where you can get nice video close-ups of objects and it stays in focus really well. And finally, moving over to night mode, or nightography as Samsung calls it, and the theme here is basically that Samsung tries to brighten up the image a little bit more, whereas the iPhone 14 Pro tries to keep the image a little bit more natural and keeps the darker areas dark. This tends to introduce a little bit more noise on the Samsung, specifically in the ultra wide shots, as that camera is just not as well equipped for nighttime photography. Again, they trade blows. In this shot, I like the way the bright area looks inside the hotel here, but the iPhone seems to have really exaggerated that orange in the sky, which is definitely a bit unrealistic. Nighttime is where zoom falls apart on the Samsung as well. On the iPhone, it's not a hell of a lot better, but I think the 3x zoom is more than reasonable in the iPhone. For selfie shots, they've both gone with a completely different colour profile, but I actually prefer the image from the Samsung here because there's a little bit more detail in my face, it looks sharper, more in focus, and the iPhone shot looks a bit mushy. In portrait mode, they both did surprisingly well, and I haven't got a favourite here, but the iPhone kept it a little bit more natural, whereas Samsung definitely upped the brightness, especially on the little vehicle here. And in terms of nighttime video, you can't really fault any of these phones in low light. I do think that Samsung raises the brightness to the point of a fault because it does introduce quite a bit of noise, but the iPhone again tends to keep it a bit more natural with the darker areas staying dark. I also noticed in video that the 3x zoom on the Samsung does seem to be sharper, but there is a little bit more noise as well. It could be that iPhone is just adding a bit more noise reduction. And the ultra wide cameras at night time are, I found, borderline unusable. It's a little bit better on the iPhone, but really I wouldn't choose either of these. So in conclusion then, which one of these is better and how do you choose between these two phones? So in terms of a choice, if you want something with a bit more versatility and something that's going to produce probably better photos straight out of camera in terms of posting to Instagram, sending to friends, and I think the S23 Ultra might be the one for you. But if you want something a bit more consistent, perhaps you want to edit your photos a bit more, the ProRAW on the iPhone 14 Pro is really good for that. And of course, if you want to shoot video, iPhone is still ahead, even though Samsung's catching up a little bit. If you mainly shoot video on your phone, the iPhone 14 Pro is the one you want to go for. But in terms of which one of these is better, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that. I think you're going to be happy no matter which one you choose. These cameras are getting so good on these phones at the moment, and I think either one will be a good option for most people.